The pre-dawn darkness at Ramitelli airfield carried a bite that cut through even the heaviest flight jacket. It was 04:45 a.m., March 24th, 1945, and Captain Roscoe Brown stood beside his P-51C Mustang, watching ground crews finish their final checks in the beam of work lights. The red paint on his aircraft's tail seemed black in the darkness, but in 4 hours, at 25,000 feet over the Austrian border, that distinctive marking would mean everything to the B-17 crews they were assigned to protect. Brown's crew chief handed him the maintenance log. Everything checked clean: oil pressure, hydraulic systems, oxygen flow rated for 8 hours at altitude. The Packard-built Merlin engine had logged 43 combat hours since its last overhaul, well within the 70-hour window before mandatory inspection. These numbers mattered. At Escort altitude, where outside temperatures dropped to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit, where a pilot breathed pure oxygen for 6 straight hours, where fuel calculations included not just the 1,500-mile round trip, but combat maneuvering reserves, mechanical reliability meant survival. Formation briefing says, "Maintain standard escort spacing," his wingman Lieutenant Earl Lane said as they walked toward their aircraft. 2,000 yards minimum offset from the bomber stream. Brown paused at his wing route, checking the security of the 110-gallon drop tanks. Standard doctrine from Fighter Command called for escorts to fly loose patterns at specified distances, close enough to respond to threats, far enough to maintain energy and tactical flexibility. The manual was clear: 2,000 yards lateral separation, 500 feet vertical offset, with roving flights sweeping ahead and behind the bomber boxes. It was doctrine written by men who valued fighter autonomy, who believed the best defense was aggressive offense, who counted victory credits as the primary measure of fighter group effectiveness. But the 352nd Fighter Group had been flying different numbers for months now. The contempt had started early, before they'd even arrived in Italy. Stateside training reports questioned whether Negro pilots possessed the reflexes for modern air combat. Even after the 99th Fighter Squadron proved themselves over Anzio, flying ground attack missions that earned commendations, the mythology persisted. When the 352nd transitioned to bomber escort duty in June 1944, taking over from white fighter groups who'd been rotating through the 15th Air Force, the whispers followed them to every officers' club they couldn't enter, every briefing room where they stood apart. Close escort, some called it, dismissively, implying the red tails lacked the aggression to hunt freely, to rack up the kill scores that made aces and headlines. Lieutenant Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. had heard it all. As commander of the 332nd, he'd made a decision that ran counter to prevailing fighter doctrine, but aligned with something more fundamental: the actual mission. Bombers reaching their targets mattered more than fighters claiming victories. Every B-17 that went down took 10 men with it. Every B-24 lost meant another gap in the formation, another weakness enemy fighters could exploit. The mathematics were stark. A single heavy bomber cost $300,000 to build and required a 10-man crew trained for 6 months. A German Me-109 destroyed in a high-altitude dogfight cost the enemy 40,000 Reichsmarks and 1 pilot. But if that same Me-109 got through to the bombers, the exchange rate shifted catastrophically. At 05:30 a.m., 48 red-tailed Mustangs began starting their engines in sequence. The Merlins coughed to life with blue flames from their exhaust stacks, settling into a rumble that shook the Italian earth. Each aircraft carried 269 gallons of internal fuel, plus the drop tanks, enough for 7 hours of cruise flight at 25,000 feet, assuming optimal mixture settings and no combat. The reality was different. Combat meant war emergency power, 67 inches of manifold pressure that burned fuel at 3 times the cruise rate. It meant violent maneuvering that could empty tanks in minutes. It meant calculating not just the distance home, but the reserves needed if weather closed alternate fields, if battle damage forced lower, less efficient altitudes, if wounded aircraft needed shepherding. Brown taxied out in the pre-dawn darkness, following the blue exhaust flames of the aircraft ahead. His P-51C weighed 12,000 pounds at takeoff with full fuel and ammunition, 400 rounds per gun for the 4 50-caliber machine guns, 1,600 rounds total. The manual said those guns, firing together, could put 40 rounds per second into a target, at typical engagement ranges of 200 to 400 yards, with closure rates sometimes exceeding 500 miles per hour. A pilot had perhaps 2 seconds of firing time per pass. The mathematics of aerial gunnery were unforgiving. Deflection angles, lead computation, bullet drop at various ranges, the curved path required to bring guns to bear while maintaining energy. The formation climbed out over the Adriatic, heading northwest toward the rendezvous point. Standard procedure called for joining the bombers at a specific coordinate, usually over Yugoslavia or northern Italy, then maintaining station through the target area and back to a release point where the bombers could safely continue alone. The B-17s and B-24s flew in combat box formations, 18 to 21 aircraft grouped in 3-dimensional arrangements designed to maximize defensive firepower. Each box stretched to roughly 600 yards wide, 400 yards deep, and 300 feet in vertical spacing. The gunners' fields of fire overlapped, creating theoretical zones of protection, but physics and geometry left gaps. Those gaps had names among bomber crews. The 12 o'clock level approach, where head-on attacks minimized exposure to defensive fire. The belly attack from 6 o'clock low, where only ball turret gunners could respond effectively. The high side pass from 2 o'clock high, using the sun and speed to slash through formations. German pilots had studied these approaches for 3 years, computing the exact angles that minimized their exposure to the bombers' 12 50-caliber machine guns while maximizing their firing windows. They knew that at a 40-degree deflection angle, they could put a 3-second burst into a B-17's wing route while exposed to return fire for less than 1 second. At 07:15 a.m., climbing through 18,000 feet, Brown's oxygen system engaged automatically. The demand regulator began feeding pure oxygen as atmospheric pressure dropped below the threshold for normal breathing. Inside his flight helmet, the rubber mask pressed against his face with each inhalation, a rhythm that would continue for the next 5 hours. The cockpit heater, fed by engine bleed air, struggled to maintain 40 degrees Fahrenheit as outside temperatures plummeted. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the canopy wherever breath moisture condensed. The bomber stream appeared ahead at 07:45 a.m., exactly on schedule. 312 heavy bombers in 17 combat boxes, stretching across 8 miles of sky, each aircraft leaving 4 distinct contrails that marked their path like arrows pointing toward the target. The Daimler-Benz Tank Works at Berlin-Marienfelde, 1,500 miles from their bases in southern Italy. The arithmetic of strategic bombing was always the same: tonnage on target versus losses sustained. Today's mission carried 2,400 tons of high explosives, enough to crater 40 acres of industrial infrastructure if accuracy held. Brown's squadron took position on the right flank of the lead bomber box, but not at the regulation 2,000 yards. He brought his flight to 800 yards, close enough to see individual turret gunners tracking their approach, close enough to read tail numbers, close enough that the bomber pilot's first reaction was alarm. This wasn't doctrine. This violated the manual's clear guidance about maintaining maneuvering room, about energy preservation, about tactical flexibility. Red Leader, this is Red 3, Lane's voice crackled through the static. We're inside minimum separation distance. Copy Red 3, maintain position. The reasoning was mathematical, though few outside the 330 seconds planning sessions understood it. At 2,000 yards, an attacking Me-109 or Fw-190 could dive from 28,000 feet, accelerate to 450 miles per hour, fire a 3-second burst at a bomber, and escape before escorts could effectively respond. The geometry was simple. At standard escort spacing, the time from threat detection to intercept averaged 12 seconds. German pilots needed only 8 seconds to complete an attack sequence. But at 800 yards, those numbers changed. Intercept time dropped to 5 seconds. The angular velocity required for escorts to track incoming threats decreased by 60%. More critically, German pilots could no longer use the escort formation itself as cover for their approach, a tactic they'd perfected against loosely spaced fighter screens. When escorts flew tight to the bombers, attackers had to commit earlier, expose themselves longer, and couldn't use high-speed slashing attacks without risking collision with the defensive screen. The 332nd had run these calculations obsessively. Major George Roberts, the group operations officer, had covered blackboards with trajectory analyses, plotting every recorded attack profile from 6 months of 15th Air Force missions. The data was unambiguous. Bomber losses correlated inversely with escort proximity up to a critical threshold of 600 yards, beyond which collision risk exceeded protective benefit. The sweet spot was 700 to 900 yards, close enough to deny attackers optimal approach angles, far enough to maintain formation integrity. At 0820 am, crossing into Austrian airspace at 25,000 feet, the first radar contacts appeared. Ground control at Foggia reported enemy fighters scrambling from airfields around Munich. Estimated 40 to 60 aircraft climbing to intercept altitude. The German response followed predictable patterns. Me-109 G10s and G14s would position themselves up sun at 30,000 feet, building energy for diving attacks, while Fw-190A-8s loaded with underwing rockets would approach from lower altitudes, trying to break up bomber formations with standoff weapons. Brown checked his fuel state. The drop tanks were half empty after 90 minutes of cruise climb. In 15 minutes, they'd reached the initial point where the bomb run would begin. That was when German fighters typically struck hardest, knowing the bombers had to maintain steady courses for their bomb runs, unable to maneuver defensively. The Norden bomb site required stable platforms for its analog computer to calculate release points. Any deviation degraded accuracy exponentially. Bandits, 2 o'clock high, approximately 15 miles and closing, the group leader Major Roberts called at 08:35 am. Estimate 20-plus aircraft. Standard doctrine would have flights peeling off to intercept, meeting the threat as far from the bombers as possible. That's what most fighter groups did. Aggressive sweeps that resulted in swirling dogfights miles from the bomber stream, dramatic combat that made for good gun camera footage and victory claims. It also left gaps in the escort screen that German flight leaders exploited ruthlessly, coordinating attacks to draw escorts away while reserve flights struck the exposed bombers. The 332nd held position. This was the discipline that outsiders mistook for timidity. At 800 yards from the bombers, the red tails maintained their stations even as German fighters approached, visible now as dark specks against the pale sky, contrails streaming from their wingtips as they maneuvered for attack position. The waiting required extraordinary nerve. Every instinct trained into a fighter pilot screamed to engage, to use altitude and speed advantage, to seize initiative. But Davis had drilled different instincts into his pilots. At 08:38 a.m., the German formation split. 12 Me-109s continued their high approach while 8 Fw-190s dove toward the bomber stream's level approach. The geometry was textbook, a high-low attack designed to fragment the escort response. If the Mustangs climbed to engage the high threat, the Fw-190s would have clear shots at the bombers. If they dove to intercept the low attackers, the Me-109s would execute diving passes from perfect positions. "Steady red flight," Brown transmitted. "Nobody breaks formation until they commit." The mathematics of interception dominated everything at these speeds. An Me-109G-14 in a 30-degree dive from 30,000 feet to 25,000 feet would accelerate to approximately 480 miles per hour true airspeed. At that velocity, it covered a mile in 7.5 seconds. The effective range of its two 13mm machine guns and one 30mm cannon was 400 yards against a target the size of a B-17. That meant the German pilot had to begin his firing solution at roughly 800 yards, giving him 1.2 seconds of firing time before minimum break-off distance. But the P-51's superior roll rate, 80 degrees per second versus the Me-109's 60 degrees, meant that at close escort distances, the Mustang could reverse into the attack faster than the German fighter could adjust its dive angle. The key was waiting until the attacker committed to his firing pass, when changing trajectory meant losing the shot entirely. At 08:39 a.m., the lead Me-109s rolled inverted and pulled through, committing to their attack dive. The angle was 28 degrees, aimed at the high squadron of the lead bomber box. "Break now," Roberts commanded. The response was choreographed through hundreds of hours of practice. The high flight of red tails rolled left and pulled up to meet the diving 109s, not in a climbing chase, but in a calculated slashing intercept that would put them beam on to the attackers at the critical moment. The maneuver required precise timing, break too early, and the Germans could adjust. Too late and they'd be through to the bombers. Brown pulled 6 Gs in the climbing turn, his G-suit inflating to prevent blood pooling in his lower body. The horizon tilted crazily as he rolled inverted, tracking the lead Me-109 through his gun sight. The German pilot saw the intercept developing and steepened his dive, trying to generate enough speed to blow through the escort screen. It was a deadly calculation. Every degree steeper meant more speed but less time on target, less stability for accurate shooting. The geometry resolved in an instant. Brown's flight curved into the attack path 700 yards from the bombers, too close for the Me-109s to engage the bombers and evade simultaneously. The German leader fired a short burst, barely a second, before braking hard right to avoid collision. His wingmen followed, their attack disrupted before achieving effective firing positions. But this was only half the attack. The Fw-190s boring in from below had counted on the Me-109s drawing off the Escort. Instead, they found the low flight of red tails still in position, having not taken the bait of the high attack. The German pilots faced an impossible choice: continue into the concentrated defensive fire of both bombers and escorts, or abort. 4 Fw-190s pressed the attack. Their approach angle, 15 degrees from below, minimized exposure to the bombers' belly turrets but brought them directly through the red tail's defensive line. Lieutenant Hugh White, leading the low flight, held his fire until the lead Fw-190 filled his gun sight at 300 yards. The convergence was set for 250 yards. At that range, all 450 caliber streams would impact within a 30-inch circle. White fired a 2-second burst, 160 rounds, watching tracers walk across the Fw-190's engine cowling. Black smoke erupted from the German fighter's engine as oil lines ruptured. The engagement lasted 43 seconds from first contact to disengagement. No bombers were hit. 2 German fighters trailed smoke as they dove away. The Red Tails had expended approximately 2,400 rounds total, less than 4% of their ammunition load. This efficiency mattered. Unlike free hunting fighters who might expend all ammunition in 1 or 2 engagements, the 330 seconds disciplined fire control meant they could respond to multiple attacks throughout the mission. At 08:52 a.m., the bombers reached their initial point and turned onto the bomb run. For the next 8 minutes, they would fly straight and level at 160 miles per hour indicated airspeed, sitting ducks for any fighter that penetrated the escort screen. The bombardiers hunched over their Norden sights, making mind corrections as the target crawled into the crosshairs. Each combat box would drop together on the lead bombardier's signal, creating a pattern designed to saturate 40 acres with high explosives. This was when the second wave hit. German fighter doctrine had evolved through 3 years of defending against American daylight bombing. They knew escort fuel states, knew the psychological pressure of the bomb run, knew exactly how long bombers had to remain vulnerable. The second wave, 30 fresh fighters from bases around Vienna, had timed their arrival precisely. They came from 3 directions simultaneously at 08:54 a.m. Me-109G10s from 12 o'clock high, Fw-190A8s from 9 o'clock level, and a mixed formation from 6 o'clock low. It was a maximum effort, the kind of coordinated assault that had shattered previous missions, sometimes claiming 20 or 30 bombers in minutes. Major Roberts had 16 Mustangs in immediate reserve, pilots who'd been flying top cover at 28,000 feet. Standard doctrine would commit them piecemeal, sending flights to engage each threat independently. Instead, Roberts concentrated 12 aircraft against the head-on attackers while keeping 4 in reserve. The head-on attack was the most dangerous. At a closure rate exceeding 600 miles per hour, German pilots had perhaps 2 seconds to fire before collision became unavoidable. But those 2 seconds, with proper aim, could saw through a bomber's cockpit, killing pilots and bombardier instantly. The attack required extraordinary nerve, pulling up at the last instant to clear the bomber's tail, often with less than 50 feet separation. Roberts led the intercept personally, diving from 28,000 feet to position his flight directly in the German attack path at 1,000 yards from the lead bomber box. The maneuver was calculated risk. If the timing was wrong, they'd be out of position to protect the bombers. But executed properly, it created a head-on merge with the German fighters at a combined closure rate of nearly 700 miles per hour. The merge was violent chaos compressed into fractions of seconds. Both formations fired simultaneously, tracers crisscrossing in a deadly lattice. A red-tailed Mustang and an Me-109 passed so close their wingtips nearly touched. Prop wash buffeting both aircraft. Another pair collided, not head-on, but a glancing blow that tore the Mustang's left aileron completely off and crumpled the Me-109's right wing. Both aircraft tumbled out of control. Captain Luke Weathers, flying Roberts's wing, snapshots an Me-109 at 100 yards, putting 60 rounds into its engine in 3/4 of a second. The German fighter's engine exploded, throwing pistons through the cowling, propeller blades windmilling as the pilot pushed the nose down, trying to maintain enough airspeed for control. Weathers had no time to watch the result. 2 more 109s were boring in, and his ammunition counter showed 1,200 rounds remaining. The flank attacks developed simultaneously. 8 Fw-190s approached the bomber formation from 90 degrees, planning to rake the entire length of a combat box with 20mm cannon fire. But the red tails assigned to close Escort were waiting at 600 yards, so close that bomber gunners held their fire to avoid hitting their escorts. Lieutenant Charles McGee, leading the close escort element, made a decision that violated every principle of fighter combat. Instead of turning into the attack to engage with forward-firing guns, he maintained position between the bombers and attackers, forcing the Fw-190s to fly through his formation to reach their targets. It was insane by conventional standards, presenting your profile to enemy fighters, relying on mutual support rather than individual maneuvering. But the mathematics worked. The Fw-190s, approaching at 350 miles per hour, had to compute deflection not just for the bombers but for the intervening Mustangs. Any firing solution on the bombers meant exposing themselves to point-blank fire from the escorts. The German flight leader held his fire, looking for gaps that didn't exist. 4 of his pilots, younger and less experienced, fired anyway. Their rounds passed over and under the bombers, deflection calculations ruined by the need to avoid the escort screen. McGee's wingman, Lieutenant Charles Bailey, saw an Fw-190 slide below their formation, lining up for a belly attack on a straggling B-17 that had fallen 300 feet below its box. Bailey rolled inverted and pulled through in a split S, dropping onto the German fighter's tail in a single fluid motion. At 150 yards, he fired a 4-second burst, 320 rounds, that stitched from the Fw-190's tail to its cockpit. The German fighter rolled slowly onto its back and fell away, the pilot either dead or unconscious. By 08:58 a.m., the attack was disintegrating. German flight leaders, recognizing the futility of penetrating the close escort screen without accepting catastrophic losses, began calling their flights off. Several Me-109s made individual passes, trying to exploit perceived gaps, but the Red Tails formation discipline held. Every attack met immediate response, not from individual defenders but from coordinated elements working in mutual support. The bomb run continued. At 09:00 a.m., the lead bombardier toggled his release switch. 312 bombers dropped 2,400 tons of high explosives in a pattern that stretched 2 miles long and half a mile wide. From 25,000 feet, the bombs took 52 seconds to fall. During that eternal minute, the aircraft held course, while their bombs descended through layers of progressively thicker air, wind drift calculations, and ballistic mathematics determining whether months of planning and preparation would succeed or fail. The target disappeared under a roiling cloud of smoke and debris. Photo reconnaissance would later confirm 60% of the factory complex destroyed or severely damaged, including the main assembly building where Panther tank hulls were manufactured. Production would stop for 8 weeks. As the bombers turned off target at 09:02 a.m., beginning their withdrawal, German fighters made one more coordinated effort. This time it was a pursuit attack, trying to catch damaged stragglers who couldn't maintain formation speed. 3 B-17s had fallen back, one trailing smoke from its number 3 engine, another with half its rudder shot away, the third simply unable to maintain power after hours at altitude with engines running at maximum cruise settings. The 332nd's doctrine anticipated this. 4 red tails immediately dropped back to close escort positions around the stragglers, not the loose oversight other groups provided, but intimate protection at 300 yards, close enough that German fighters couldn't isolate individual bombers. Lieutenant Spurgeon Ellington took position directly above a damaged B-17, whose ball turret was frozen, its gunner trapped inside with hydraulics shot out. From this position, Ellington could cover the bomber's entire belly, the area its disabled turret could no longer protect. 3 Me-109s made runs at the stragglers, but the geometry was impossible. To engage the bombers, they had to fly through the Escort's gun envelopes at point-blank range. The first attacker took 40 rounds in his wing root and rolled away trailing fuel. The second aborted his run entirely. The third tried to sneak in from directly below in the bomber's blind spot, only to find Ellington already there, waiting. A 2-second burst into the Me-109's cockpit ended that attack permanently. At 09:20 a.m., with fuel states becoming critical, German fighters began disengaging. They'd lost 6 aircraft confirmed destroyed, 11 damaged, for no bombers shot down. Not one of the 312 heavies under the 332nd's protection had been lost to enemy fighters. Some had battle damage, holes from the few rounds that got through, but every crew would make it home. The flight back stretched endurance to its limits. Drop tanks had been jettisoned during combat, leaving only internal fuel for the 900-mile return flight. The Mustangs throttled back to maximum range settings, 35 inches of manifold pressure, 1900 RPM. Mixture leaned until the engines ran rough, then enriched just enough for smooth operation. At these settings, fuel consumption dropped to 50 gallons per hour, but airspeed fell to 220 miles per hour. True. The mathematics were unforgiving. 900 miles at 220 miles per hour meant 4 hours and 5 minutes flight time. With 90 minutes of fuel remaining, the margin for error was essentially zero. Lieutenant Harold Sawyer watched his fuel gauges with growing concern. His aircraft had taken several 20mm hits in the left wing, and, though nothing vital seemed damaged, fuel consumption was running 5 gallons per hour higher than normal. Either there was a small leak, or the damaged wing skin was creating enough additional drag to require more power. At 10:45 a.m., still 500 miles from base, his main tank showed 35 gallons remaining. The calculation was simple: he wouldn't make it. Brown noticed Sawyer gradually falling behind the formation. Blue 3, what's your fuel state? 34 gallons, about 40 minutes at current consumption. While the distance to Ramitelli was 420 miles. 1 hour and 55 minutes at cruise speed. Sawyer was an hour short. The options were limited: bail out over Yugoslavia and hope partisan forces found him before German patrols, or divert to an emergency field closer to the front lines. Neither was appealing. Yugoslavia meant weeks of hiking through mountains to reach Allied lines, assuming he survived the landing and evaded capture. The emergency fields were often under German artillery observation, subject to harassment fire. Brown made a command decision. Blue Flight, we're going to tow Blue 3 home. It was a technique they'd practiced but never attempted over such distance. By positioning aircraft in extremely close formation, wingtip, overlapping wingtip by inches, the trailing aircraft could ride in the lead's wingtip vortex, reducing induced drag by up to 15%. In theory, this could cut fuel consumption by 7 to 10 gallons per hour. In practice, it required extraordinary flying skill to maintain position in turbulent air while exhausted from 6 hours of combat operations. Sawyer tucked in behind Brown's right wing, so close that oil streaks on Brown's fuselage were clearly visible. The slipstream buffeted his aircraft constantly, requiring continuous micro-corrections to maintain position. 1 moment's inattention could mean collision, but the fuel flow gauge began dropping. 44 gallons per hour, then 42, finally stabilizing at 41. It would be close, but possible. They crossed the Italian coast at 11:30 a.m. with Sawyer showing 8 gallons remaining. Ramitelli was 70 miles inland, 18 minutes at current speed. 8 gallons at 41 gallons per hour meant 11 minutes of powered flight. They were 7 minutes short. Brown called ahead to Ramitelli Tower. Have emergency equipment standing by. Blue 3 will be dead stick from 10 miles out. The descent began at 11,000 feet, trading altitude for distance in a careful calculation of glide ratios. The P-51 clean, gear and flaps up, could glide approximately 2 miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude in still air, but Sawyer's damaged wing degraded this ratio, and headwinds over the Italian plains further reduced glide distance. The mathematics became a real-time differential equation, constantly adjusted for actual versus theoretical performance. At 11:43 a.m., Sawyer's engine coughed and died, fuel exhausted with the runway still 6 miles distant. He was at 4,000 feet, theoretically enough altitude to glide home with 500 feet to spare. But theory and reality diverged. The damaged wing created asymmetric drag, requiring constant rudder input to maintain heading, which further increased drag. The glide rate deteriorated from 500 feet per mile to 600, then 700. I'm not going to make the field, Sawyer transmitted at 2,000 feet, still 3 miles out. Gear up, belly it in the clear area short of the runway, Brown instructed. We'll have you picked up in minutes. Sawyer held his approach as long as possible, stretching the glide with microscopic stick movements that traded speed for distance at the very edge of stall. At 500 feet, 1 mile short, he accepted the inevitable. The gear stayed retracted as he set up for a wheels-up landing in an olive grove just short of the airfield perimeter. The Mustang touched down at 90 miles per hour, belly plates screaming against rocky soil, props bending backward as they bit earth. The aircraft slid 300 yards, shedding pieces of aluminum skin, before coming to rest against an ancient stone wall that had marked property boundaries since Roman times. Sawyer was out and running before the dust settled, standard procedure in case of fire. No fire came. The Mustang sat broken but intact, another red tail that had brought its pilot home against the odds. Within minutes, a jeep arrived to collect Sawyer. Within hours, maintenance crews would strip the aircraft for salvageable parts. The engines, radios, and instruments would fly again in other airframes. Nothing was wasted in this arithmetic of war where every component had measurable value, including the pilots themselves. The debriefing that afternoon revealed the mission's statistics in stark detail. The 332nd had flown 48 sorties, engaged approximately 60 enemy fighters, claimed 6 destroyed and 11 damaged. They'd expended 18,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, roughly 40% of their total load. 4 red tails had been damaged, 1 lost to fuel exhaustion, but all pilots returned. Most importantly, every one of the 312 bombers they'd escorted had survived to bomb the target. The contrast with other escort missions was telling. 2 days earlier, another fighter group escorting a similar mission had claimed 11 enemy fighters destroyed, but lost 7 bombers to enemy action. A week before that, aggressive escort tactics that sent fighters chasing German interceptors miles from the bomber stream had resulted in 15 victory credits, but 12 bombers shot down when German reserves exploited the gaps. The mathematics of glory versus mission accomplishment played out in these stark differentials. Colonel Davis addressed his pilots that evening in the briefing room, its walls covered with maps, target photos, and the chalkboard calculations that governed their lives. His words were measured, carrying the weight of command decisions that balanced individual achievement against collective purpose. Gentlemen, I've heard the talk. Other groups call us timid. They say we lack aggression because we don't chase victories, don't run up our scores. Let them talk. Our job is not to become aces. Our job is to bring bombers and their crews home. He pointed to the mission statistics chalked on the board. 600 bomber crewmen flew under our protection today. That's 600 Americans who'll write letters home tonight instead of being telegraphed as missing or killed. That's our scoreboard. Captain Edward Gleed, one of the squadron commanders, had been keeping detailed records since the 352nd began escort duty. His notebooks contained more than anecdotal evidence. They held mathematical proof. Over 6 months of operations, bombers under 352nd Escort had suffered the lowest loss rates in the 15th Air Force, 0.08% per sortie, compared to the overall average of 1.3%. The difference seemed small until multiplied across hundreds of missions, thousands of sorties. It meant approximately 200 bomber crewmen alive who statistically should have been dead. The tactical innovation went beyond simple proximity. The 352nd had developed specific techniques for different threat scenarios, each based on careful analysis of German tactics. Against head-on attacks, they positioned flights directly in the approach path rather than attempting beam intercepts. Against pursuit attacks on stragglers, they maintained multiple layers of close escort rather than single roving defenders. Against coordinated multi-angle attacks designed to fragment escort response, they held position until attackers committed, then responded with concentrated rather than distributed force. These tactics required exceptional discipline. Fighter pilots were trained for aggression, selected for competitive instincts, rewarded for victory claims. To fly close escort, to watch enemy fighters maneuvering for position and weight, to let them close to minimum range before responding, to break off pursuit when bombers were threatened elsewhere went against every instinct. It required subordinating personal glory to mission success, individual achievement to collective purpose. The mechanical demands were equally severe. Close escort at 25,000 feet meant 6 to 8 hours at altitude, breathing pure oxygen through masks that chafed and froze, fighting off hypoxia that clouded judgment and slowed reactions. The extreme cold, often 70 degrees below zero just outside the canopy, meant constant vigilance against frostbite. Pilots flew with silk gloves under leather gauntlets under winter mittens, multiple layers that had to be stripped off instantly when combat began. They learned to recognize the symptoms of oxygen deprivation, the insidious euphoria that preceded unconsciousness, the tunnel vision that meant seconds remained before blackout. The P-51C Mustangs they flew were marvels of engineering optimization, but they demanded precision handling. The laminar flow wing that gave them exceptional range was unforgiving at high altitude. Stall characteristics changed dramatically in thin air, and ham-fisted maneuvering could result in violent departures from controlled flight. The Packard Merlin engine, producing 1,400 horsepower at sea level and over 1,600 at war emergency power, required careful management. Push too hard and detonation would destroy cylinders in seconds. Run too lean and exhaust valves would burn. The coolant system operated at the edge of boiling, 230 degrees Fahrenheit, with glycol that would flash to steam if battle damage breached the system. Lieutenant Colonel Clarence "Lucky" Lester understood these margins intimately. On January 27, 1945, he'd been leading close escort when 8 Me-109s bounced his flight from above. Standard doctrine would have been to break into the attack, trading altitude for airspeed in a turning fight. Instead, Lester held position, letting the Germans commit to their diving passes. Only when they were fully committed, energy bled off in their attack dive. Did he break? The violent 6G pull-up put him directly behind three Me-109s that suddenly found themselves slow and vulnerable. In 90 seconds of concentrated violence, Lester destroyed three enemy fighters, not through superior aircraft performance, but through superior tactical positioning. The gun camera footage from that engagement became a training film, analyzed frame by frame. At time, index 0 or Lester's flight maintains close escort, 800 yards from the bomber formation. At 0:03, Me-109s visible diving from 2 o'clock high. At 0:08, Lester begins his break turn, not earlier when the threat was identified, but at the precise moment the attackers could no longer abort. At 0:11, his gun sight Pipper settles on the first Me-109 at 200 yards range. The deflection angle is 15 degrees, requiring half a ring of lead. At 0:12, he fires 120 rounds in a 1-second burst. Strikes visible on the German fighter's fuselage and left wing root. At 0:13, the Me-109 begins an uncontrolled roll to the left, glycol streaming from its punctured cooling system. The second and third kills followed in rapid succession, each a product of patience and positioning rather than aggressive pursuit. By holding close escort until the critical moment, Lester had forced the German fighters into an impossible tactical situation, committed to attacks they couldn't complete, slow and predictable in the bombers' defensive envelope, unable to use their preferred hit-and-run tactics. Word of the 332nd's effectiveness spread through the bomber groups. Crews began requesting red tail escorts by name, knowing the statistics even if they didn't understand the tactics. When bomber pilots saw those distinctive scarlet tails sliding into close formation, stress levels measurably decreased. Heart rate monitors used in medical studies showed bomber crews' pulse rates dropping by an average of 12 beats per minute when red tails appeared. Technical Sergeant William Aku, ball turret gunner on a B-17 named Reluctant Dragon, described the psychological impact. When you're hanging in that ball turret, nothing between you and 25,000 feet of empty air except a thin aluminum shell, watching German fighters lining up for passes, you're making peace with God every second. But when those red tails showed up and tucked in close, I mean really close, like you could see the pilots' faces, it was like having guardian angels. They wouldn't leave us, wouldn't go glory hunting. They'd sit right there and make those German bastards come through them to get to us. The Luftwaffe noticed too. Intelligence intercepts revealed German fighter pilots specifically discussing tactics against the Negro unit with red markings. The close escort formation presented unique challenges. Standard attack doctrine relied on escorts being drawn away, creating temporary gaps. When escorts maintained station regardless of provocation, German flight leaders had to develop new approaches. Some advocated overwhelming force, massing 60 or more fighters against a single bomber group. Others proposed standoff attacks using rockets or aerial bombs, but nothing fully solved the tactical problem of escorts who simply wouldn't be drawn away. On March 31st, 1945, Major Roberts led what would become one of the most analyzed missions of the war. 43 red tails escorted bombers to the Moosbierbaum oil refinery in Austria, 1,200 miles from base. German defenders launched 78 fighters in successive waves, the largest defensive effort in months. The attacks came from every angle, every altitude, using every tactic in the Luftwaffe playbook. The 352nd's response was methodical, almost mechanical in its precision. Each flight maintained its assigned position until German fighters entered the critical envelope, roughly 1,000 yards from the bombers. Only then did they engage, and only long enough to disrupt the attack. No pursuit beyond visual range of the bombers. No individual heroics. Just disciplined, coordinated defense that turned each German attack into a bloody calculation of acceptable losses. The results spoke for themselves. In 47 minutes of continuous combat, the 302nd destroyed 13 enemy fighters, damaged 6 more, and didn't lose a single bomber. They expended 72% of their ammunition in controlled bursts, averaging 3 seconds per engagement. The German attacks, which should have overwhelmed the escort by sheer numbers, broke apart against the wall of disciplined resistance. Lieutenant Hugh White's combat report from that mission provided insight into the tactical minutiae. At 1147 hours, observed 12 Me-109s positioning for head-on attack from 12 o'clock level. Maintained escort station until range decreased to 900 yards. Executed brake turn to position 020 degrees magnetic, placing flight in optimum intercept geometry. Engaged lead element at range 250 yards. Deflection angle 18 degrees. Fired 2-second burst, approximately 160 rounds. Observed strikes on engine cowling and canopy. Target rolled inverted and dove away trailing black smoke. Immediately reversed to escort station. Total time away from assigned position, 18 seconds. 18 seconds. That was the discipline. Engage, destroy or disrupt, return. No victory rolls, no pursuit of damaged aircraft, no attempt to pile up personal scores. Every second away from escort position was a second bombers were vulnerable. The maintenance demands of this kind of flying pushed ground crews to exhaustion. Each mission meant 8 hours of flight time, but 20 hours of maintenance. Crew Chief Marcellus Smith, responsible for Captain Lee Archer's aircraft, kept meticulous logs that revealed the hidden arithmetic of air combat. After each mission, inspect all flight control surfaces for battle damage or fatigue cracks. Borescope each cylinder for detonation damage. Check magnetos for timing drift. Test all electrical circuits for shorts caused by vibration drain and replace oil that had been cooked to the consistency of tar after hours at high power settings. Patch bullet holes with precisely riveted aluminum plates. Recalibrate gun sights that wandered from the constant vibration of firing. The Merlin engine was particularly demanding. At 25,000 feet, running at 45 inches of manifold pressure for cruise, the engine internals experienced stresses equivalent to those in a Formula One race car. Every 50 hours, roughly 6 combat missions, the engine required a complete teardown inspection. Connecting rod bearings wore at predictable rates. Valve guides enlarged from the constant thermal cycling. Spark plugs fouled from the lead in 100-octane aviation fuel, requiring cleaning or replacement every 20 hours. Smith's records showed that maintaining one P-51C in combat-ready condition required approximately 300 man-hours of maintenance per month, $15,000 in spare parts, and 1,200 gallons of fuel for test flights and engine runs. Multiply that by 48 aircraft in the group, and the logistics became staggering. Every bullet fired, every gallon burned, every rivet replaced had to be shipped from the United States across submarine-infested Atlantic waters, then trucked over Italian mountain roads to reach Ramitelli. Yet, the system worked. The 302nd's operational readiness rate, the percentage of aircraft available for missions, consistently exceeded 90%, among the highest in the 15th Air Force. This wasn't luck or superior equipment. It was the product of systematic attention to detail, the same discipline that characterized their flying. Ground crews worked 18-hour shifts during surge periods, sleeping under the wings of aircraft they were servicing, eating meals one-handed while safety wiring control cables. The human cost accumulated in less visible ways. Combat stress manifested differently at 25,000 feet than in ground combat. There were no foxholes to dive into when flak started bursting, no cover when traces filled the air. Pilots sat strapped into aluminum cocoons, watching anti-aircraft shells explode in black puffs that looked deceptively harmless until shrapnel punched through aluminum skin with sounds like hammers on sheet metal. They breathed oxygen that dried throats raw, fought controls that grew heavy as hydraulic fluid leaked from damaged lines, watched friends' aircraft disintegrate in balls of fire with no way to help. Flight surgeon Vance Marchbanks tracked the psychological toll through medical records that revealed patterns. After particularly intense missions, pilots reported symptoms that would later be recognized as acute stress response. Trembling hands that couldn't be controlled, inability to sleep despite exhaustion, hypervigilance that made them jump at backfiring engines. Some developed rituals, specific ways of entering the cockpit, particular items carried on every mission, prayers or phrases repeated before engine start. These weren't mere superstitions, but psychological anchors, ways of maintaining control in situations where death was measured in fractions of seconds and degrees of deflection. The 332nd lost 66 pilots over the course of the war, lower than many groups, but each loss felt deeply in a unit that numbered fewer than 400 pilots total. They gathered for memorial services in the chapel at Ramitelli, a converted farmhouse where Catholic Mass and Protestant services alternated. The padre, Captain Elmore Kennedy, would read the names, their hometowns, their ages, many just 22 or 23 years old. Then formation flights would pass overhead, one position conspicuously empty, the missing man formation that said everything without words. But the mission continued. By April 1945, with German resistance crumbling, the 352nd had evolved their close escort doctrine to near perfection. They could predict German attack patterns based on weather, time of day, target selection. They knew that morning missions faced fresher German pilots, that attacks intensified when bombers approached rail junctions, where German fighters could use terrain for concealment, that wounded stragglers attracted fighters like blood-in-water drew sharks. The final statistics were remarkable. Over 312 missions, the 332nd flew 15,533 sorties, escorted bombers on 179 missions, engaged enemy aircraft on 112 occasions. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, with another 150 probably destroyed or damaged. They lost 27 aircraft to enemy action, a victory-to-loss ratio of better than 4-1. But the number that mattered most was this. Bombers under their escort suffered the lowest loss rate of any fighter group in the 15th Air Force. While perfect records are mythology, bombers were occasionally lost to flak or mechanical failure. The 332nd's record of protection was unmatched. Their insistence on close escort, derided by some as overly conservative, had proven to be tactical innovation of the highest order. The legacy extended beyond statistics. When President Harry Truman integrated the armed forces in 1948, the 332nd's combat record provided irrefutable evidence that performance depended on training and leadership, not race. When the Air Force became an independent service in 1947, the tactical lessons of close escort were incorporated into doctrine. The concept of disciplined mutual support over individual achievement became a cornerstone of American fighter tactics, influencing everything from Vietnam War fighter-bomber escorts to modern close air support doctrine. General Benjamin Davis would later reflect on the strategic implications. We understood that we were fighting two wars, one against fascism abroad, another against prejudice at home. Every bomber crew we brought home safe was not just a tactical victory, but a strategic argument for equality. We couldn't afford to be good. We had to be better. And that meant reimagining what fighter escort could be when discipline mattered more than glory. The mathematics of their achievement resonated through history. In raw numbers, 27,000 tons of bombs delivered on target under their protection. Approximately 3,000 bomber crewmen who returned from missions when statistics suggested they shouldn't have. A new paradigm for fighter escort that prioritized mission accomplishment over personal achievement. These weren't just numbers, but lives preserved, families unbroken, a demonstration that excellence could emerge from any background when given opportunity and purpose. The Red Tails became legend, but not the kind built on mythology. Their legend was constructed from the mundane arithmetic of war. Fuel calculations scratched on kneeboards, deflection angles computed in milliseconds. The geometries of interception plotted and replotted until they became instinct. They proved that the best warriors were not always those who sought glory, but sometimes those who understood that the greatest victory was bringing everyone home. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the men of the 332nd had completed their last combat mission 6 days earlier, escorting reconnaissance aircraft, photographing damage assessment of the collapsed Reich. They'd begun as an experiment, barely tolerated and widely doubted. They ended as one of the most respected fighter groups in the European theater, their red tails a symbol that transcended the aluminum aircraft that bore them. Colonel Davis's final mission report contained a telling line. This organization has demonstrated that technical proficiency, tactical discipline, and moral courage can overcome any obstacle, whether imposed by the enemy or by prejudice. It was understated, almost bureaucratic in its language, but it captured something essential. The 332nd hadn't just fought a war, they'd proved a principle that human capability was limited only by opportunity, not by the artificial constructs of race. The trigonometry of their achievement was written across the skies of Europe. The calculated angles of intercept, the parabolic curves of pursuit, the vectors of protection that brought bombers home. Every equation balanced, every trajectory computed, every mission a demonstration that excellence was a matter of training and discipline rather than accidents of birth. In the end, the Red Tails' greatest victory wasn't measured in enemy aircraft destroyed, but in the mathematics of prejudice itself, proving that the only relevant calculations in combat were those of capability, courage, and commitment to the mission. The Tuskegee Airmen had broken the rules of Escort doctrine and in doing so had saved hundreds of American lives. They'd violated the manual's guidance about maintaining separation, ignored the emphasis on victory credits, subordinated individual achievement to collective success. Their close escort tactics, born from the necessity of proving themselves beyond doubt, had evolved into the most effective bomber protection scheme of the war. The numbers told the story that no prejudice could refute. The lowest bomber loss rate in the 15th Air Force, a 4-to-1 kill ratio against enemy fighters, and most importantly, thousands of American bomber crewmen who made it home because Red Tails flew closer than the regulations said they should. It was a lesson written in contrails across the European sky. Sometimes the best way to protect those counting on you was to break the rules that said you had to keep your distance.